bit about, I guess we could call it the evolution of cells, and where cells sort of come from. We've already talked a little bit. Oh, let me fix that problem. Okay, so we've already discussed a little bit about, how we can go from molecules to things like primitive cell membranes in our previous lessons. So now we're going to look at what happens when you get an actual cell. So cells basically come in two kinds. There's two major divisions of cells. And the first major division is called the prokaryotes. Prokaryotes. These cells have, they're called this, the word karyote refers to the nucleus of the cell. Okay? And so a karyote, referring to the nucleus, if you're a prokaryote, that means before the nucleus. No nucleus. So these cells do not possess a nucleus. That's how they got their name. No nucleus. They also have fewer organelles. You do have some, but remember what organelles are, right? That's our word for all the little structures inside the cell, the mitochondria, all the different things, Golgi apparatus, and so on. There are fewer organelles. So generally speaking, we could say that, they're less organized. They're less organized. Or organized, I forgot my little A in there. So the most common representative of this kind of cell is the bacteria cell. These are the bacteria, and of course we know bacteria are bad. They're germs, right? And they make us sick. But actually there's a lot of bacteria that do very useful, good things. And in fact, without bacteria as the starting point of life, the rest of it couldn't happen. So bacteria are perhaps what we would call the most primitive cells that we have. And they've been around for billions of years. A lot of us don't really have a good sense of the timeline of life, because when we learn science, we learn bits and pieces and we don't get to see the whole story. And so, perhaps on another day we could do a lesson on the timeline of life. But bacteria were first, we've actually found fossilized bacteria that go back 3.5 billion years. Okay? That's a long time ago. It's almost hard to imagine. And these cells are still with us. They are still doing their thing, and we can still find their descendants, not the same cell obviously, but their descendants. They've been reproducing and creating little cell babies for billions of years, and they're still with us. They're the oldest type of cell. But they're very simple. So instead of drawing a bunch of these pictures, I'm going to just show them to you, and then I'm going to get you to sketch them. All right, instead of me drawing them, I'm going to go with a picture here that I have. So let me just jump to that now. And here's a picture of a bacteria cell. Oh, wait a minute. For some reason, we got something else jumping up here, and I don't know why. Okay, we fixed our problem. So this is a typical sort of bacteria cell, and maybe I can enlarge that a little bit if I try. Is there a zoom here? Let's zoom in a little bit, bring it a little bit bigger. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to draw a sketch of this. Okay, now I want to point out a couple of things when you draw your sketch. Start by drawing the membrane. You don't have to draw this section over here that's all sort of opened up. You don't really need to draw that. That's just peeled away to show you sort of some of the structure underneath. So you don't need to worry about that, okay? Let me erase that little thing there. Oh. I guess I just do this with the eraser. Okay, so back to there. I'll erase that there. But you'll notice that the membrane is not just a single line. There's a yellow part and a green part. And then there's a little white part. So maybe when you draw it, why don't you draw the membrane first, okay? draw the membrane, and then on the outside of the membrane, there's a cell wall. So you see it right over here on the left side there. There's a green cell wall on the outside of the membrane. And then on the outside of that, there's a yellow part. So there's actually 3 parts to this. Okay? Actually, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll do it together like this. We'll just jump back here and we'll draw. So let's take black color with a fine line like this. Let's draw a picture like this. Let's draw the membrane around like this. And it's like a little sausage shape, just like that. There's our cell membrane. And then let's take this sort of green color. Let's make it a little bit thicker. And then just kind of go around the outside like this. We'll call it a cell wall. That's what it is. So right away you think, oh, is that like a plant? Well, yes and no. It's not a plant because plant cells have not yet evolved on the scene. This is just the bacteria. So you can see how these bacteria had a cell wall even before the plant cells. And then in another color, maybe I'll take this purpley color that shows up and I'll do another little sort of thick layer on the outside. Like this. So there's a 3-layered sort of section here. There's a membrane, a cell wall, and this part which is called the capsule, or it's the outermost part. And this is secreted by the cell, and it's basically a protective layer. Okay, so after you're finished with that, we go back to our picture. All right, we can see them labeled over here. The cytoplasmic membrane, which is the same as the cell membrane, the cell wall, and the capsule. So those are what we've just drawn, and we'll label them after. Okay. You'll also notice on the outside there are tons of little cilia all over the place, and there's also flagellum. They labeled this one incorrectly, really. If you're pointing to one, it should be a flagellum. But I think for simplicity, bacteria often have several flagella. So they drew only one, but maybe that's to show that there could be more than one. That's why they wrote it in the plural, flagella. So let's draw some cilia and flagella on our bacteria cell as well. And remember, when we draw stuff like this, it's because we want to learn and exercise our brain and engage all these different parts of our brain. So it doesn't matter if our picture is beautiful or not. It's an exercise. We're not trying to produce artwork. We're just trying to draw and learn and talk and listen and use our hands so that all of our parts of our brain are engaged in what we're doing. So we'll draw some cilia all around the outside here, wiggly things like this. And you'll remember that these cilia are very important for several different functions, right? They can be sensory. They can help the bacteria sense things in its environment, like if it bumps into something, the cilia can let it know. Just kind of like the hairs on your arm. If somebody brushes your arm, you can feel, even if they don't touch your skin, it touches the hairs, right? And it moves the hairs and you can feel it. So the bacteria can use these as a sensory kind of thing, but they can also use them to help move as well. They can beat them in patterns and make currents and things and move them around. And then we have a couple of flagella. So let's put a little sort of thing here. I'll turn this guy into a flagellum. Make it a little thicker so it stands out more like a tail. There. And I'll put another one up here, because just to remind us that, you know, there is often more than one. There's another one. Many times you'll see bacteria with 10, 12, 15 or more flagella flipping all around. They're quite interesting. Okay, let's go back to our picture now and see what other things we can find. We've pretty much got the outside. Notice that they're using a different word here. They're calling these Pili, P-I-L-I, instead of cilia. And the reason for that is because they are a slightly different structure. Okay, but you could be forgiven for calling them cilia. On this cell, they're called Pili, slightly different structure, but for our purposes, we'll just we won't worry too much about all the details. Remember, we're just getting an introduction to all this, right? We just want to get an idea in our head of what a bacteria looks like. So we're not going to sweat all the details of this particular cell. Now, look inside the cell, and you'll see there's a big sort of soupy hodgepodge. You don't see a nucleus. You don't see a lot of other things. All you really see are ribosomes, which are important because those are the protein factories, and almost all living things need, well, I can probably say with certainty that all living things require proteins to do their jobs. So you see there are ribosomes inside there, the little black dots. And then there's, this is sort of pointing to the cytoplasm, which refers to all the gunk inside. Remember, the liquidy part is the cytosol. And then you'll see this nucleoid. Well, it's not really a structure at all. What it is it's the DNA, the genetic material of the bacteria cell, and it's not in a nucleus. It's just all blobbed all over the place around inside there without any protection at all. So it's a very simple cell. And you could see how this could have evolved, you know, from the most primitive of those membranes that we talked about, with some of these molecules being stuck inside. And so this is the first sort of stage of cell development, the prokaryotic bacterial cell. So let's go back and fill in the middle of our cell with a few things. What this picture doesn't show is that often, you see that blue strand of genetic material there, the DNA, often in the bacteria, it's actually in a ring shape. This one's all sort of tangled up, but they also contain little rings, and those are kind of interesting, and in grade 11, you'll learn what those do. But they're all just basically genes for now. So let's put inside, I'll use blue like they did, and let's put a sort of a windy bunch of material. Okay, so let's just label it. Instead of using the word nucleoid, I'll label it a simpler word. And then let's put some little ribosomes. What color should we use? How about red? We haven't used that. So I'll put lots of little dots all around here, ribosomes, which are very important. So really, if you think about it, this is just a very simple protein machine. It's got instructions in the DNA, and it's got ribosomes to make them. But it sort of just does it all right inside the cytoplasm there, and it doesn't have more organized factories, right? The cell that we saw yesterday had ribosomes inside the endoplasmic reticulum. And there were Golgi apparatuses to help with the proteins, and there were, there was a nucleus holding on to the DNA. Well, here there isn't. It's just kind of a big soup. So it's very primitive. But inside the cytosol, inside that liquid, all of those chemical reactions that would have happened in the organelles of the other cells are still happening. All right, so let's put some labels on this. I'll get them black and use this for some labels. So we have the flagellum. Okay, there's a flagellum right there. And we have what are called the pili, which are sort of like the cilia. I'll put a little, all those guys, right? They're not quite the same structure, but they're very, very close. And then you have inside three things. So we have to label the purple part. Maybe I'll color code this so it's easier to see. The purple part is the capsule. That's the purple. If I go in here and put an arrow right there, I hope you can see that, right? That's the whole purple part. The green part is the cell wall, which gives it some rigidity and protection. And then the black part is the membrane, the cell membrane or the plasma membrane or whatever. We often have slightly different names for things in bio that we can use interchangeably. So we'll call it the cell membrane because it is a cell, right? It's a bacterial cell. And then on the inside, we have basically two things that we've got here. We've got the DNA material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to label this blue, and I'm just going to call it the genetic material. Right? And maybe we can put DNA in brackets there. DNA. Or if you want, you can write, the genes. The genes, which are the instructions. Every cell needs to have these instructions. And then lastly, we have the red structures, which are the ribosomes. So we'll label those like this. So you can see the bacteria is pretty primitive. It's also usually quite small. Quite small. Just down in the corner here, if I were to draw, a typical animal or plant cell, it would be about this big. If I were then to draw a bacterial cell beside it to get the size, these bacteria cells would probably be only about that big. So they're also very tiny in terms of their size. They're probably the smallest of cells. And of course, they can skitter about and do all kinds of things. And we'll talk about what they can do in a minute. Now, the next thing would be sort of the next step up, or the other type of cells. And these are the ones that are more organized. So we see lots of bacteria cells, but then after, a little while later in the timeline, where if we go back 3.5 billion years, we see these cells. Then all of a sudden, maybe a few 100 million or even a few billion years later, I'm not sure the exact time, but there is the appearance in our fossils of cells that have nuclei, cells that are more organized. So obviously something happened, right? They changed. These cells evolved, and slowly over time they got more complex. So let's move on then to the next part. Just before we move on, I should mention that bacteria cells, because they're alive, and we'll talk about what it means to be alive very soon, they are constantly taking things in through their membranes, and they're also inside their cytoplasm. They're doing stuff. Chemical reactions are happening. And bacteria often have other ways of getting energy besides using oxygen and sugar. They have the more primitive reactions that give them energy from really strange things, okay? Other kinds of molecules or compounds. And when they make their products, they can make really weird stuff. So we call that metabolizing, right? Or catabolizing, that's the word. When you talk about your metabolism, that describes all the chemical reactions that are building things and breaking things inside your body. So this little guy, they can take in various nutrients. And then they have a bunch of different reactions that produce energy, but also really strange molecules. Things like hydrogen sulfide, which stinks. Bacteria make a lot of stinky waste products. So whenever something goes bad and bacteria start to grow in it, often we notice that they smell, right? Bacteria can also make things, molecules that are toxic to other living things like us. So when you get bacteria in your body, the bacteria themselves don't actually hurt you, but they make toxic chemicals and they spit them out, and then they go into your body and cause problems. And so we have to be careful. Bacteria definitely can be dangerous germs because they're secreting dangerous things, toxins that are affecting people like us. Okay, so let's go on there. There's our bacteria. Whoops, let's go back up a little bit. Okay, so now the next sort of group of cells is called the eukaryotes. Okay? The eukaryotes have a nucleus. They have a nucleus and more organelles, more structures inside. So they're more organized inside their structure. They've got more complicated things, more organized. And of course, there are lots of examples of these. So with the bacteria cells, there's lots of different bacteria cells, and bacteria cells come in all different shapes and sizes too. The one we drew was sort of a little sausage-shaped one, but some bacteria are more roundish, like this. I'm not sure where that came from. Okay. Strange things are happening in the technological world today. So sometimes they're round, sometimes they're sausage-shaped, like the one we just drew. Sausage-shaped. Sometimes they have a weird sort of spirally shape. It's hard to draw. They twist and turn. They have spiral shapes. And they often stick together. Bacteria like to stick together often in colonies. So you'll often see a bunch of bacteria like this all stuck together in colonies. And so there are lots of different shapes and sizes. But even though there's different shapes like this and sizes, they're all pretty much the same sort of organization. Okay, very simple. Now, when you get into the eukaryotes, we have lots more variation. So eukaryotes can be divided into sort of a couple of groups. There's the single cells that live alone. And these are called the protists. And we actually saw some of those in the video we watched the other day, and we're going to try to see some more, and I'm going to show you some pictures of them. So these little protists live all by themselves. They do not join together very often. So let me show you a picture of some of the protists, just to have it on record here on the video. I can probably do it here. This looks like it here. But see, I'm pressing that, but it's coming up the wrong one. Hang on. Okay, I found it. Here's the picture we want. And these are some examples of some of the different cells that live alone. They're all single cells, but they have all the stuff we had drawn in our animal and plant cells. They have chloroplasts, some of them. They have cilia, they have flagella, they have mitochondria and endoplasmic reticula, and they definitely have a nucleus where the DNA is locked up tight inside and, makes it more protected. So there's lots of different shapes and sizes. They come in all different forms. And some of them can swim around. Some of them just kind of float around. Some of them are green. If you look at them and they're green, that usually means two things. Either they can make their own food because they have chlorophyll or chloroplasts of some kind, or it means that they happen to eat a lot of green algae, algae is basically just some of these are algae, right? When we talk about algae in the water, that's what we mean. Vast colonies of little creatures. And they eat each other, and there's a whole world going on inside a drop of water where these things are constantly floating around and attacking and eating and preying on each other and doing their thing. And there are so many different shapes and sizes. The amoeba, this one here, is sort of the one that oozes around, right? That's how it moves. This one looks like a paramecium. It's got lots of cilia, and it can rapidly beat the cilia, and it can shoot through the water. This one looks like, this one here looks like a euglena. It's got the tail on it. But what's interesting with this one, it's got a tail and it swims around, but it also has chloroplasts, and it can go to the light and make its own energy or make its own sugars. So we can't call these plants or animals. They're in their own little world because some of them run around like animals or swim around, but also have chlorophyll. So they have plant and animal together. They're more primitive, probably, than plant and animal cells. And animal and plant cells would have evolved out of these protists later on. So we still haven't got to where we were yesterday with our plant and animal cells. Okay, so that's what they look like. And we're not going to get into too many details. Just want you to be aware of them. In grade 11, you'll study them all and learn more about each one and what they do. So these are the protists. But the key thing for us to remember is that they live alone. They do not stick together and form anything bigger than one cell. Every protist is pretty much just one cell, with a few exceptions. Okay? Let's go back to here. Single cells, protists, lots of different kinds. Then, here's another picture, if it'll work for me. See if I can't get this picture to come up. These are protists, but they're weird protists. You'll notice there are several. There's about, 8 different little cells in that center picture, and they're all sort of held together in a clump with this sort of thing all around the outside holding them all together. At some point, back in the history of life, these little cells began to stick together and learn to live together and cooperate. So imagine a world where all the cells are going in alone, but now some of them have developed the ability to stick together and actually cooperate with each other. And when they do that, they do something very cool. if you're a single cell, you have to take care of everything, right? Think about a single parent. They have to take care of everything in the house. But if there are two parents, then they can share some of the work, right? Well, in this case, the cells that stick together, they can start to share some of the work of being alive, and they don't have to take care of everything. So that's kind of important. This is called Volvox. That's his name. And he is potentially one of the first cells that learn to stick together, which means we are made of cells that stick together. So if we go back in our family tree billions of years, we may find that a certain species of this Volvox is actually an ancient ancestor to the human race even, and to just about every other animal that exists as well. Because this key moment of turning into multicellular, that's key. That's how you make bigger animals. So that's an interesting protist to talk about. So single cells, but then eventually cells developed the ability to clump together, and share the tasks of staying alive. Okay? That means the cells stop doing everything on their own and they begin to pick a certain role to play. When cells pick a certain role, we say that they specialize. The cells begin to specialize. Or sometimes in biology we use the word differentiate, which means to sort of, they begin to branch off into different things. It's kind of like for humans, we have mechanics who know lots about cars, but maybe they don't know a whole lot about kidneys. So we have doctors who know lots about kidneys, but they're not very good at all the laws of taxes and accounting and money. So we have accountants who learn those jobs. And everybody does their own thing, right? We have people who become nurses, but maybe they're not very good at cooking. So we have bakers, and we have different people who do different things. Maybe we have the bakers make an awesome souffle, but if your plumbing breaks, they don't know what to do. So we have plumbers. So people are differentiated. We have specialized into different jobs. And as long as we have somebody doing all the different jobs, we live in a whole community that supports itself and everything gets done. And that's kind of what happens with these cells that begin to live together. They can share. They can share the load, right? And each cell picks a certain job to do and gives up doing the other job. So your kidney cells are very good at pulling sort of waste products out of your bloodstream. But they're not very good at contracting to make like a muscle cell is. So the muscle cell is very good at contracting, but it can't filter wastes. And a nerve cell can pass along chemical signals, electrochemical signals, and it's really good at that, but it can't contract or it can't filter. So in our body, we have all these different cells, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that later, that concept. So cells begin to stick together. When they begin to stick together, we get multicellular life. Multicellular life. Okay? And so multicellular life then leads us to plants and animals. Plants, animals, but also funguses or fungi. These are things that are usually made up of multiple cells. Some, trying to think, there are some funguses, I think. Yeah, they're pretty much all multicellular for the most part, at least for our purposes today. There's always exceptions in biology, but you learn about those exceptions later on. So plants and animals and fungi are multicellular. You never see a single cell animal or a single cell plant. If you do, it's a protist. And so we drew pictures of these cells, the plant cell and the animal cell, in our previous lessons. So we already know a little bit about what they look like. So now we're sort of up to speed on all the different types of cells. Okay, so now, to sort of summarize, we go from biological molecules. So these are things like fats, proteins, right? I'll put that, let me make a smaller line here. These are things like fats, proteins, carbs, carbohydrates, and so on, floating in the sea. And eventually, that gets us to primitive cell parts, like membranes and things. Primitive cell parts. Which then leads us to, obviously, the most primitive of all cells. Remember, primitive means the sort of oldest. Primitive cells, and those, of course, are the prokaryotes, or bacteria cells. And they're interesting. They all live alone. They're single cellular life, all living alone, one cell at a time. Actually, bacteria do live in what we call colonies, but they don't really help each other out that much. They just kind of all clump together, but they're still all doing all the jobs themselves, so to speak. Okay? Then, from the primitive cells, we get more advanced cells, which are eukaryotes. They have the nucleus. And the eukaryotes then give us all kinds of things. So the eukaryotes are basically, well, let me put it this way. Let me erase that. We have the single cell eukaryotes. So I'll put a line here. Single celled that live alone, which are the protists, and we saw pictures of all them. And then we also have, sort of coming out of that, eventually these protists developed multicellular life. Multicellular, cellular, right? And the multicellular are the plants, animals, and fungi that we see all around us. We call this macroscopic life. Most single cells require a microscope to see them. We don't even know they're there, whereas multicellular life can grow very large, like people and elephants and blue whales and even dinosaurs and things like that. Okay, so there's the kind of, and it's interesting. One of the examples we talked about of multicellular life, the very first multicellular protist was the Volvox. That's just an example. So there's sort of a summary of everything that we've talked about here over the past little while. And of course, you can go back and look at it. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be alive, since these are all these cells and we call them alive. And so now we have to talk about what it means to be alive. So, being alive. There's a very fine line between things that seem like they're alive, because they do a few things that kind of amuse us. And we say, oh, look at that thing. It looks like it's eating. Maybe that means it's alive. But there's actually a number of conditions that are required for being alive. If something is alive, first of all, it has to be able to obtain nutrients. It has to find food, right? Somehow. Because living things all require energy. So obtain nutrients. Let's put this down. Living things all require energy. And you'll remember from our discussions, in order to build bigger things that are more complicated out of smaller things, it always requires energy, right? You can't get molecules to become bigger things unless you add energy to them. Plants add energy through molecules like carbon dioxide and water and turn it into a bigger, complicated sugar molecule, but they have to use sunlight to do it. So living things, because all living things are complicated things made out of molecules that have turned into something complicated, there always has to be energy going in. So that's how we do it. We obtain our nutrients, our food, and we get this energy. Now, there's two basic ways to do it. The two basic ways to do it are either through sunlight and photosynthesis, right? Or you've got to eat. You've got to eat other things that are either alive, or you've got to collect molecules from your environment somehow. So either you do it by sunlight or you do it by eating. In the protist world, there's a whole bunch of variations. They do both. But later we notice that, like, for instance, animals no longer have any ability to use sunlight. We just eat. Whereas plants don't really need to eat. They can get enough energy from sunlight, and we start to see that changing. And of course, if you're obtaining nutrients, you're also using those nutrients, breaking them apart, digesting them. Chemical reactions are happening, which means you're always going to produce waste. Right? And both of these things, this process of obtaining nutrients and using all the chemical reactions of your body to break them down and build up things and break things and build things and break things and build things, that's called our metabolism. Our metabolism. Now, there's two words here. There's breaking apart, which is called catabolism, and building together is called anabolism. But we're just going to lump them together for today. And remember that the word metabolism refers to all these chemical reactions of building and breaking inside of our bodies. And we do that because we need the nutrients and the energy to extract energy from the environment in order to become more complicated. So that's one important thing about being alive. But there's another important thing about being alive, and that is you have to be able to reproduce somehow. Whoops, I can't spell at all. Let me start over on that one. Reproduce. Reproduction is important because if you can't make a copy of yourself, let's say you become alive and you're doing your thing and you're taking in food and you're giving out waste. Well, guess what? When you eventually die, there's nothing left and everything would stop. So there has to be a way for you to continue the chain, right? And make copies of yourself. Make copies of yourself. And what we're going to see is there's actually many different ways for that to happen. There's lots of different ways for reproduction to happen. It's actually quite fascinating. You know, we get caught up in our own little world of humans and we think about having babies and how we do that, and, and we forget that flowers have sex. We're like, what? Yeah, they do. Flowers actually have sex. They just do it in a very different way than we do. Obviously, very hard for them to meet people at the dance because, of course, they can't move very well. So instead, they use bees and insects and wind and things to sort of spread their pollen around. But they still do have sex. It's weird. And some things just kind of break into two, just like that. Other things grow little extensions out of themselves that then develop and become, there's lots of different ways of doing this reproduction. But it has to happen somehow, right? And not only do you have to copy the body, but you also have to copy the genes. And that's one of the things we said about DNA. It has this cool ability to be copied. It can copy itself. And so reproduction is probably one of the main definitions of, or the main requirements of being alive. Okay? Usually, if you're alive, there's lots of other things we could put down, but they kind of all go back to that first thing. Like, for instance, you have to interact with your environment somehow. So when you talk about interacting with your environment, often that's to find food, right? In order to interact with your environment, you pretty much need to have some kind of sensory ability, whatever that might be. Now, we, of course, have senses, right? we often refer to the five senses, but there's actually more than five. There's lots of different ways of sensing the environment. So just to give you some examples, like humans can see and we can hear and touch things, but sharks can sense electromagnetic fields. They have special sensors that they can sense electricity in the water. And all living things have a little bit of an electrical nature to them, and so they can find prey even in the muddiest, dirtiest water. We know about bats and things who have super hearing. They can hear very high-pitched sounds and use it as a way to locate, right, to echolocate and see in the dark, kind of, basically. There are lots of different things. Now, some of this sensory stuff is very basic. So you remember in the movie we watched, there was the little euglena. Here's a little euglena with his little tail. And he had a little red, what they called an eye spot. And of course, he's filled with chlorophyll because he wants to make energy from sunlight. Well, if it's dark, he's not going to survive. And so there has to be a mechanism to make sure that little euglena is able to find sunlight. And the little red spot are cells that are sensitive to light. And so if he's swimming around, it's not like he has a brain. It's not like he says, gee, I wonder where I'll go for supper tonight. You know, he's not picking McDonald's or Burger King. He's just a mindless little cell that's floating around. But the little sensory cells here, or a sensory device, it's not, he's one cell, so this is just a structure inside. It's made of molecules that when light hits them, they react by causing a reaction that changes the behavior of this cell, this euglena. And so when it gets bright, he swims towards the brightness. So he's in the sunlight. If it's too bright, too hot, too much sun, he swims away. If it's dark, he swims. So that little spot is a sensory organ, but it's not an eye. It doesn't see like our eyes. It's just molecules. It's probably similar to some of the molecules in our eyes, and you can see how this might evolve over millions of years into a more complicated light-sensing structure like the eye. But in the euglena, it's just a little tiny blob of special molecules. And still, it's a way to sense the environment. So all living things have to be able to sense a little bit about what's going on around them. The cilia and the pili, those can be, they can sense movement and currents in the water and things like that. Some little animals, when they're moving, for instance, I think it's the paramecium, and paramecium is very common. He's the guy, he's sort of roundish like this. He's got a little groove on the side, and he's got all kinds of little cilia all around him, and he beats the cilia, then he swims around. Well, what happens if he bumps into something? He can't see, he's got no way to know, so if he bumps into an object, what happens if there's an object here? Let's say there's a big thing. The paramecium has been shown in experiments. He'll swim up here, he'll bump into the object, he'll reverse, and then he'll turn his body a certain number of degrees, and it's always the same. I don't know what it is, maybe it's 25 or 30 degrees. And he'll go forward again, and he'll bump, so he'll back up, and then he'll turn his body another 30 degrees, and he just keeps doing that until he can actually swim past the object. It looks like he's making decisions. It looks like he's smart and he's thinking about how he's not. It's just a little pattern, and it always gets him out of trouble, right? Very primitive. It's funny how when we look at primitive things, it looks like intelligence, but it's actually not. It's weird. Then it starts to make you wonder if we are actually as intelligent as we think. So that's interesting too, sensing the environment. But we're going to focus on these two things: the being alive, obtaining nutrients to acquire the energy you need, and producing wastes, and reproducing, and interacting with the environment. Sensory ability is one thing, but let me also add a couple other things. There are problems, right? Well, if you live in the water, getting water is not a problem. But what if you live on the land? You need mechanisms to then either protect you from losing too much water or gaining water. So we could say that being alive, not only do you need to have sensory ability, but you need to be able to preserve, manage, and collect not just food, but minerals, water, etc. Things that we don't use for energy, but we still need them. And you got to manage them. Okay? Here's an interesting thing that happens. If you take a cell that lives in salt water and you put it in fresh water, it'll have a problem. If a cell lives in salt water, so here's some salty water, what that means is there's salt in the water and there's salt inside the cell, and it's usually pretty balanced, so he's happy. But if you take him and you put that guy with all his salty insides into fresh water, which has very little salt, guess what happens? The water rushes through the membrane and tries to even this out, causing him to swell up and explode. So if he's going to live in this fresh water, he's going to have a way to pump water out all the time. So that's what we mean. There has to be a way to manage things in your environment. So that's another important sort of thing. I'm going to call these things the jobs of life, right? That's what we're going to call these. The jobs of life, all the things that have to be done. If you're a single cell, and this is what's important, we're almost done now. If you're a single cell, you must perform all the jobs of life. You're on your own. You must do all of these things. And that's a lot of work. But if you become a multicellular organism, multicellular life form of some kind, then the cells that are within you can share the jobs or sort of spread them out. And that's what we call cell specialization. When a cell decides it's going to do a particular job instead of doing all the jobs. And that's one of the reasons why multicellular life is so successful. So you could think of it, imagine, just to finish as another example, let's say a bunch of people are lost on a desert island, right? Here's your desert island. And all these people are on the island. Well, if everybody just tries to take care of everything, everybody builds their own hut, has to go collect their own firewood, has to go find their own food, collect their own berries, fish for fish, hunt some animals, shelter, whatever, find water, then you don't get very far because it's too much for everybody to do. But if you assign jobs and you say, okay, your job is water, so you go find enough water for everybody. And you're going to build the shelter, so you build the shelter. And this person's your buddy, they're going to find wood to build the shelter for you. And this person's going to take care of the fire to keep the fire going. And this person is going to look for berries, and so on. What we do here is we differentiate or we specialize in a job. The person looking for berries no longer has to worry about finding water because somebody else is taking care of it. And so in a cell system where you have many cells all joined together like this, the cells can do this same sort of thing. One of them can worry about finding food, another one can worry about sensing the environment, and another can worry about, pumping out water, and another can worry about removing waste products, and so on. And that's called cell specialization. It's a very important concept. And that brings us to the point where now we're ready to start looking at what cells can do when they do begin to stick together, and how they stick together and turn into things larger, like us. We're almost getting ready for that next section. So we'll stop here for today.